The echo of two legendary acoustic guitars fills the vast empty auditorium until a harsh dissonant chord slices through the air like a bullwhip. The music stops dead. The visual shock is immediate and magnetizing on the million-dollar illuminated stage where the two greatest living legends of country music freeze in place. George Strait, the very personification of the stoic cowboy, and Dolly Parton, glowing in rhinestones, stop breathing. The camera focuses on George's eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his pristine Stetson hat. His gaze is not on the sheet music or the documentary cameras recording the rehearsal, but piercing into the shadows of the 15th row. Down there in the middle of a sea of empty red velvet seats, a frail elderly woman wearing a frayed wool coat and clutching an old crochet purse is being physically cornered and yanked by the arm by two massive suited security guards and a young, arrogant image director from Los Angeles. The contrast between the royalty of the stage and the corporate brutality against the simplicity of that humble woman creates an unbearable tension. The silence that follows is not empty, it is the sound of a storm about to break in the form of the quiet, devastating wrath of a Texan. The majestic, moody theater in the heart of Texas usually feels like a sanctuary, but today the atmosphere is heavy with a strange, unnatural pressure. Outside, the brutal afternoon sun beats down on the asphalt, baking the earth and sending waves of heat shimmering across the dusty roads that lead out into the vast, open ranchlands. The smell of an approaching summer storm hangs in the air, that distinct metallic scent of Texas rain waiting to wash the world clean. But inside the theater, the environment is artificially chilled. The massive air conditioning units pump a freezing, sterile breeze through the vents, contrasting sharply with the sweat and soul of the music being created. The air in the auditorium smells of the ozone burning off the high-powered stage lights, the bitter aroma of stale coffee from the tech cruise station, and the comforting, familiar scent of worn leather radiating from the boots of the man standing at the center of it all. On the stage, magic is attempting to unfold, despite the sterile corporate environment trying to suffocate it. Dolly Parton stands radiant, a beacon of warmth and undeniable talent, her laughter usually ringing out like silver bells, but now silenced by the sudden shift in the room's energy. Beside her stands George Strait, a man carved from the very bedrock of the American West. His posture is perfectly straight, his shoulders broad, his hands calloused from years of gripping reins and guitar necks alike. He is a man of few words, governed by a strict internal code of honor, where yes ma'am and no sir are not just pleasantries, but the foundation of a civilized life. He adjusts the strap of his acoustic guitar, his face a mask of granite and polite reserve. They are here to prepare a historic duet for a massive national television special, a broadcast meant to celebrate the roots of country music. But the roots are exactly what the people running this production seem determined to sever. Pacing the floor of the orchestra pit like a caged predator is Vance, the television director, flown in specifically from the West Coast. Vance is a man who measures worth in follower counts and profit margins. He wears an impeccably tailored designer suit that costs more than a ranch hand's yearly salary, and his feet are clad in pristine leather loafers that have never touched dirt, let alone the mud of a cattle pen. He holds a glowing tablet in his manicured hands, constantly swiping and barking orders at the local Texas crew, treating the hard-working men and women hauling cables and adjusting lights as if they were nothing more than inconvenient peasants. For Vance, this television special is not about the music or the soul of the working class. It is a stepping stone for his career, a highly curated aesthetic experience meant only for exclusive VIPs, high-rolling investors, and the coastal elite. He despises the grit of the country universe and is obsessed with sterilizing the environment until it shines like a fake plastic diamond. Far away from the blinding glare of the spotlights hidden away in the comforting shadows of the 15th row sits a woman who represents everything Vance despises and everything George Strait reveres. Her name is Clara. She is 82 years old, and her presence in the velvet seat is a miracle of sheer willpower. Clara's hands resting nervously on her lap are a map of a lifetime of relentless labor. The joints are swollen with arthritis, the skin thin, and spotted the nails clipped short and devoid of any glamour. For 40 years, those hands flipped burgers, scrubbed grease from cast-iron griddles, and poured endless cups of black coffee. at a small weathered roadside diner off a forgotten stretch of highway. She's wearing a faded floral dress and a frayed grey wool coat that has seen decades of winters pulled tightly around her frail shoulders to ward off the biting chill of the theatre's air conditioning. Resting on her lap is an old handmade crochet purse, its yarn thinning and losing its color. Clara did not come here to cause trouble. She did not come to demand backstage passes, beg for autographs, or seek attention from the documentary crew. She traveled 6 grueling hours on a cramped Greyhound bus, watching the endless miles of barbed wire fences and grazing cattle roll by just to be in the same room as the music. Her health has been failing her heart, growing weaker with each passing season, and she knew deep in her soul that this might be her very last chance to hear the Strait boy sing before her traveling days were over for good. She managed to slip through the heavy brass doors at the back of the theater thanks to an old janitor, a man who used to eat at her diner decades ago, who recognized her kind eyes and quietly unlocked a side entrance so she could sit in the dark and listen. She promised him she would be as quiet as a church mouse. She just wanted to close her eyes and let the music wash over her. The conflict ignites when Vance's restless, predatory eyes scan the dark sea of empty seats, looking for camera angles and symmetry. The bright screen of his tablet casts a pale blue glow on his face as he squints into the shadows. His gaze stops abruptly on row 15, seat B. His face contorts in a mixture of confusion and profound disgust. To him, the elderly woman sitting there is not a human being. She is an anomaly, an eyesore, a stain on the flawless aesthetic of his multi-million-dollar set. She does not possess the polished, wealthy look of the sponsors he is trying to impress. She looks poor. She looks old. She looks like she belongs in a forgotten, dusty town, not in his exclusive television production. Without a word to the stage, Vance abandons his post by the monitors. He snaps his fingers, signaling 2 massive security guards dressed in identical dark suits and earpieces to follow him. They march up the carpeted aisle, their heavy footsteps muffled, but their intent loud and aggressive. The closer Vance gets, the more enraged he becomes at the sight of Clara's worn orthopedic shoes and the frayed edges of her coat. He does not see a grandmother. He sees an intruder, a vagrant who has somehow breached his fortress of exclusivity. Clara is lost in the melody. Her eyes closed her head, nodding slightly to the rhythm of Amarillo by morning, when the harsh beam of a high-powered flashlight strikes her directly in the face. She gasps, her hands flying up to shield her sensitive eyes. Vance stands at the edge of the row, his hands on his hips, his expression twisted into a sneer of absolute contempt. The 2 towering security guards flank him, blocking any chance of retreat. "How did you get in here?" Vance demands, his voice dripping with venom, echoing slightly in the vast space. This is a closed set, a multi-million-dollar production, not a homeless shelter. Clara's heart begins to hammer violently against her frail ribs. The sudden aggression terrifies her. She lowers her hands, her voice trembling but retaining that inherent dignity that only a woman who has survived decades of hardship can possess. "I am so sorry, sir," she whispers, her southern drawl thick and polite. "A kind gentleman at the back door allowed me to step inside just for a moment. I promise I'm not making a sound. I just wanted to hear the music. I will sit right here and not bother a soul." Vance lets out a harsh, mocking laugh that cuts through the quiet theater. "A kind gentleman," he repeats sarcastically, looking back at his guards. "We have a major security breach because some local idiot decided to run a charity operation. Listen to me very carefully, old woman. This event is strictly for executive producers, sponsors, and VIPs with a net worth you could not even comprehend, let alone spell. You do not belong here. Look at you. You are tracking dust into a venue that costs more per hour than your entire miserable life is worth." Clara shrinks back into the velvet seat, the cruel words striking her like physical blows. She clutches her old crochet purse tighter against her chest, a protective shield against the humiliation. "I did not mean any harm," she says, her eyes welling with tears that she stubbornly refuses to let fall. "I just wanted to hear George. I knew him when he was just a boy. I just wanted to listen. You and every other delusional vagrant in this state," Vance spits, taking a step closer, invading her personal space. His expensive cologne is suffocating, drowning out the smell of the theater. "I do not care what delusions you have in your head. You are leaving right now. Get up. Clara tries to comply. She places her trembling hands on the armrests of the seat, pushing her frail body upward. But the arthritis in her knees flares up a sharp, agonizing pain that makes her gasp and sink back down for a fraction of a second. She needs just a moment to gather her strength, to force her old joints to work. But Vance has no patience for the struggles of the elderly. His schedule is tight, his ego is massive, and his tolerance for anything less than instant obedience is zero. "Move it," Vance snarls, losing the last shred of his fabricated professional veneer. He reaches out his manicured hand, flashing with an expensive watch, and grabs the strap of Clara's crochet purse, intending to haul her out of the seat by force. The violence of the gesture is shocking. Clara cries out in alarm, gripping the body of the purse with all her meager strength. "Please, no," she begs. "That is all I have." But Vance rips his arm back with brutal force. The old brittle yarn of the purse cannot withstand the violent tug. With a sickening tearing sound, the strap snaps. The body of the purse rips open. Time seems to slow down as the contents of Clara's entire life spill out into the air. Dozens of faded Polaroid photographs, heavy silver coins, wrapped hard candies, a small worn Bible, and a collection of folded yellowed letters cascade downward, hitting the carpeted floor with a series of tragic, muffled thuds. The items scatter under the seats, rolling into the darkness. Clara lets out a devastating sob, not of physical pain, but of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. She drops to her knees on the floor, ignoring the agonizing fire in her joints. Her trembling, calloused hands scrape frantically against the carpet, trying to gather the faded photographs. These are not just pieces of paper. They are the only surviving memories of her late husband, of her small diner, of a life built on honest sweat and quiet sacrifices. She is completely vulnerable, kneeling in the dust, her dignity being crushed under the polished leather shoes of corporate arrogance. "Leave the garbage," Vance commands, his voice devoid of any human empathy. He gestures sharply to the security guards. "Get her out of here. Drag her out if you have to. I want her thrown onto the street immediately." The two massive guards step forward. One of them grabs Clara's left shoulder, his thick fingers digging into the frayed wool of her coat, while the other reaches for her right arm. They begin to haul the frail 82-year-old woman up from the floor, pulling her away from her scattered memories. Clara weeps openly now, her tears falling onto the dark carpet, her hands reaching desperately toward a faded photograph of a young cowboy that lies just out of her reach near Vance's expensive shoe. The feeling of absolute powerlessness is suffocating. The sheer injustice of a lifetime of hard work and quiet decency being violently erased by superficial elitism burns like acid. If you also believe that respecting our elders and honoring our hard-working roots is worth more than any bank account or corporate title, subscribe to the channel right now. Because what George Strait is about to do will echo through the halls of country music history forever. Up on the brightly lit stage, the music had been flowing beautifully. George and Dolly were locked in a perfect harmony, the kind of sound that can only be produced by decades of lived experience and genuine sorrow. But George Strait is not just a singer. He is a rancher, a cowboy, a man whose survival has always depended on his ability to read his environment, his eyes forged by years of scanning endless horizons for stray calves and watching the subtle shifts in weather patterns are incredibly sharp. Even through the blinding glare of the spotlights, his peripheral vision catches the unnatural, jerky movements in the shadows of the 15th row. He sees the flashlight beam. He sees the aggressive posture of the men in suits. He sees the flash of the crochet purse tearing. And then, as his eyes adjust to the darkness beyond the stage, he sees the frayed grey wool coat. He sees the silver hair. He sees the frail woman being hauled to her feet by men 3 times her size. A memory hits George Strait with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. It is a memory from 40 years ago. A memory of a freezing Texas morning, of an empty stomach of pockets lined with nothing but lint and broken guitar picks. He remembers the smell of grease and black coffee. He remembers a small diner on the edge of nowhere. And most importantly, he remembers the woman who stood behind the counter, a woman who never asked for a dime, who slid a hot plate of eggs and thick-cut bacon across the formica table and told a starving young musician to eat up because he had a long road ahead of him. He remembers the day that same woman quietly slipped a pawn shop ticket into his hand, having traded her own gold wedding band, just so he could afford the studio time to record his very first demo tape. The realization of who is being assaulted in the dark auditorium freezes the blood in George's veins. The stoic calm that usually defines him shatters, replaced by a towering, silent fury. George brings his large, calloused right hand down hard flat against the steel strings of his acoustic guitar. The dissonant, violent chord echoes through the theater, killing the melody instantly. The sudden silence is deafening. Dolly Parton, startled by the aggressive sound, stops singing mid-note. She turns to look at George, her eyes widening in surprise. She has known this man for decades, and she has never seen the expression that currently darkens his face. His jaw is locked, his eyes are cold and dangerous, and his entire body is coiled with the explosive tension of a predator about to strike. "Stop the cameras," George's voice booms through the microphone. It is not a frantic yell. It is a low, gravelly command that vibrates with absolute, terrifying authority. It is the voice of a man who does not need to shout to be obeyed. Every technician, every cameraman, every producer in the room freezes. The red recording lights blink off. The theater holds its breath. George does not wait for a response. He unclips the leather strap of his legendary guitar and shoves the priceless instrument into the chest of a stunned roadie, who scrambles to catch it. He does not walk toward the stairs at the side of the stage. He walks directly to the front edge, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. Without a moment's hesitation, the 70-year-old icon leaps from the high stage down into the orchestra pit. He lands with the agility and grace of his youth, his boots hitting the concrete with a heavy, ominous thud. The physical act alone is enough to send a shockwave through the crew. George Strait does not rush. George Strait does not break protocol. But right now, the king of country music is marching through the aisles like an avenging angel. He ignores the frantic questions of the stage managers. He ignores the producers scrambling out of their chairs. He walks with a terrifying, deliberate pace up the center aisle, his eyes locked entirely on Vance and the two security guards holding the frail woman. The sea of velvet chairs seems to part for him. The air in the theater grows heavy, suffocating under the weight of his presence. Vance, hearing the commotion, turns around. The arrogant sneer on his face falters slightly as he sees the tall, imposing figure of the music legend bearing down on him. Vance is a man used to dealing with pampered celebrities with fragile egos who can be manipulated with contracts and flatteries. He has absolutely no idea how to handle a furious Texas cowboy who operates on a moral code older than the dirt outside. Mr. Strait, Vance begins, his voice losing its confident edge, his hands fluttering nervously. "I apologize for the interruption. We are just handling a minor security issue. This trespasser snuck in, and we are simply removing her so she does not ruin the aesthetic of the shot. We will be ready to resume in 2 minutes." George does not stop walking. He does not acknowledge Vance's words. He closes the distance until he is standing directly in front of row 15. The two massive security guards, looking up at the furious face of the legend, instinctively loosen their grip on Clara's arms. They take a step back, their corporate loyalty instantly evaporating in the face of genuine authority. Clara stands trembling, her breathing shallow, her face stained with tears. She looks down at her scattered memories on the floor, too ashamed to look up into the eyes of the man she came to see. She feels nothing but disgrace, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. George stops. He looks at Vance for a fraction of a second, a look of such profound disgust that the director physically recoils. Then George turns his back entirely on the executives and the cameras. Slowly, deliberately, George Strait reaches up and removes his pristine Stetson hat. He holds it against his chest, a gesture of absolute respect. And then, right there in the middle of the dusty carpet, surrounded by the spilled contents of a broken purse, the king of country music drops to his knees. He ignores the dirt on his expensive jeans. He ignores the gasps from the producers behind him. He reaches out his large, calloused hands and begins to gently gather the faded Polaroid photographs from the floor. He picks up the heavy silver coins. He retrieves the small, worn Bible. Clara lets out a choked gasp. "George," she whispers, her voice breaking. "Oh, George, you should not be down there. You will ruin your clothes. Please do not trouble yourself for an old fool." George pauses his hands, holding a faded photograph of Clara's late husband standing in front of the diner. He looks up from the floor, his eyes meeting hers. The cold fury in his gaze is gone, replaced by a well of deep, overwhelming tenderness and sorrow. He reaches out and gently takes her trembling, arthritic hands in his own. His grip is warm, solid, and incredibly safe. "Mrs. Clara," he says, his voice thick with emotion, barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a lifetime of gratitude. "You should not be on the floor. You should never be on the floor." He stands up slowly, keeping her hands safely enveloped in his. He towers over her, using his own body as a shield between her and the cruel corporate world that just tried to break her. He looks at her frayed coat, at the tears tracking through the wrinkles on her face, at the sheer exhaustion in her posture. "I'm so sorry," Clara whispers, a tear escaping and rolling down her cheek. "I just wanted to hear you sing one more time. I did not mean to cause a fuss. I know I do not belong in a fancy place like this." "You belong wherever you want to be," George replies, his voice steady and fiercely protective. "You belong here more than anyone else in this building." He turns his head slowly. He places his Stetson back on his head, pulling the brim down low. When he looks at Vance, the tenderness is instantly replaced by a cold, calculating wrath. The silence in the theater is absolute. Every camera is off, but every eye is fixed on the confrontation. The air crackles with the impending detonation of a man who has finally had enough. Vance tries to salvage his authority, puffing out his chest and adjusting his expensive jacket. "Mr. Strait, I understand you might have a soft spot for the locals, but we have protocols. This woman is a liability. She does not fit the demographic of the sponsors. We need to maintain a certain standard of excellence for this broadcast." George lets go of Clara's hands and takes one single step toward Vance. The director immediately takes 2 steps back, hitting the edge of the velvet seat. "A standard of excellence," George repeats the words, tasting like poison in his mouth. His voice is dangerously quiet, forcing everyone in the room to lean in to hear him. "You want to talk to me about standards, son?" Vance swallows hard sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, despite the freezing air conditioning. "I am just doing my job, George. I am protecting your brand." "My brand," George says, a bitter, humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth. He points a long, calloused finger directly at Vance's chest. "Let me tell you about my brand." George raises his voice just enough so that it echoes off the high ceilings, reaching the ears of every single executive producer and technician hiding in the shadows. 40 years ago, George says, his voice ringing with absolute clarity, "I was a nobody playing in dive bars for empty rooms. I was freezing, I was starving, and I was ready to quit. I had holes in my boots and not a single dollar to my name." He gestures back to the frail woman standing behind him. "This woman right here, Mrs. Clara, ran a little diner off Highway 87. She saw a skinny kid who was losing hope. For 6 months, she fed me 3 meals a day and never once asked for a dime. She told me to save my money for guitar strings. And when I finally got a chance to record a demo tape when I needed $50 for the studio time, and the bank laughed in my face." George's voice breaks slightly. He stops, swallows hard, and forces the emotion down, replacing it with pure steel. "She took off her gold wedding band, the only thing of value she had left in this world, from her dead husband, and she pawned it. She handed me the cash and told me to go sing." A collective gasp ripples through the crew. The producers in the front row suddenly look sick to their stomachs. Vance's face drains of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. George steps closer to Vance, his physical presence completely overwhelming the smaller man. "You stand here in your imported suit with your tablet and your corporate buzzwords, and you tell me she does not fit the demographic. You tell me she is tracking dirt into your venue." George leans down, his face inches from Vance's terrified eyes. This tour, George growls, every word a hammer blow this stage. "The lights, the cameras, and the paycheck that bought those expensive shoes you are wearing. Every single piece of it exists because 40 years ago, this woman believed in me when nobody else did. She is the foundation of the house you are standing in. And you just threw her memories on the floor." Vance opens his mouth to speak, but no sound comes out. He looks around desperately for backup, but the security guards have retreated into the shadows, and the producers are staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact. Suddenly, the sound of slow, deliberate clapping breaks the heavy silence. Everyone turns to the stage. Dolly Parton has descended the stairs and is walking down the aisle. The rhinestones on her outfit catch the light, but there is nothing soft or glamorous about her expression right now. Her eyes are blazing with the fierce protective fire of a woman who clawed her way up from the dirt floors of a smoky mountain cabin. She walks right up to the group, stopping beside George. She crosses her arms over her chest, looking Vance up and down with absolute disgust. "Where I come from, son." Dolly says, her iconic voice stripped of all its usual bubbly warmth, replaced by a sharp Appalachian steel. "You do not ever raise your hand to someone's mother. You do not disrespect the people who paved the roads you drive your fancy cars on." She looks at the main executive producer, who is cowering near the soundboard. "We have a problem here," Bob Dolly calls out to the producer. "Because as long as this boy in the suit is breathing the same air as us, I am not singing a single damn note. And neither is George." The producer panics. A delay in this rehearsal costs tens of thousands of dollars a minute. He scrambles forward, waving his hands frantically. "Dolly, George, please, we can fix this." Vance was out of line. He misunderstood the situation. "I did not misunderstand anything," Vance stammers his ego, making one final suicidal attempt to save face. "I am the director. I call the shots on this floor. I am trying to make you look good." Dolly lets out a sharp laugh that sounds like breaking glass. "Honey," she says, leaning in close to Vance, "the only thing you are directing today is a taxicab back to the airport. You are fired." Vance's jaw drops. He looks at the producer. "Bob, you cannot let her do this. I have a contract. I am the creative visionary here." The producer looks at the two biggest legends in the industry, standing united protecting a frail old woman in a frayed coat. The choice is not even a choice. "Pack your things." Vance, the producer, says, his voice cold. "You are done here. Get off my set." The reversal of fortune is absolute and devastating. The same two massive security guards who had just violently grabbed Clara now step forward and flank Vance. So one of the guards says, his voice deep and menacing, it is time to leave. Vance looks at George, his eyes wide with shock and humiliation. He tries to muster a final insult, but the stoic, terrifying silence of the cowboy completely breaks him. Defeated, stripped of his power and his dignity, the arrogant director turns and walks up the aisle escorted by the guards, his expensive shoes making a pathetic scuffling sound against the carpet. The heavy brass doors at the back of the theater open and swallow him, spitting him out into the brutal Texas heat. The toxic energy leaves the room with him. The air conditioning suddenly feels less sterile. The silence in the theater is no longer tense but reverent. George turns back to Clara. The storm in his eyes has completely vanished, leaving only the quiet, steady loyalty of a man who never forgets his debts. He bends down and picks up the broken crochet purse, holding it as if it were made of fragile glass. He hands it back to her, gently pressing the gathered photographs and coins into her trembling hands. Clara is weeping silently, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what just happened. "I am so sorry for the trouble, George," she whispers. "I should just go home now." George shakes his head, a soft, genuine smile finally breaking through his stoic features. "No, Mom," he says softly. "You are not going anywhere. The show has not even started yet." He offers her his right arm, the crook of his elbow extended with the perfect chivalry of a Southern gentleman. Clara hesitates, looking at her worn shoes and then at his pristine pearl snap shirt. "Take my arm," Mrs. Clara George insists gently. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she loops her arm through his. George Strait, the king of country music, turns and begins to walk back down the aisle, leading the frail 82-year-old former diner cook, not toward the back exit, but directly toward the brightly lit stage. Dolly Parton walks on Clara's other side, gently placing a hand on the old woman's back, guiding her with warmth and respect. The crew watches in absolute stunned silence as the three of them ascend the wooden stairs. George calls out to the stage manager, "Bring a chair out here, the most comfortable one we have, and put it right dead center." A crew member scrambles, bringing out a plush leather chair from the green room and placing it exactly on the center mark, right between George's microphone stand and Dolly's. George gently helps Clara sit down. She sinks into the soft leather, looking out at the vast empty theater from the perspective of the legends. The bright lights wash over her, illuminating the frayed edges of her coat and the deep lines of her face, making her look not like an intruder, but like the honored matriarch of the entire production. George picks up his acoustic guitar, slipping the leather strap over his shoulder. He checks the tuning, his calloused fingers moving with practiced grace. Dolly steps up to her microphone, a radiant smile back on her face, her eyes shining with unshed tears. George looks at the sound booth. "Turn the cameras back on," he commands. The red recording lights blink back to life, but George does not look at the lenses. He does not look at the empty velvet seats. He turns his body completely facing the frail woman sitting in the leather chair. Mrs. Clara George says, his voice echoing through the theatre, rich and full of emotion. 40 years ago, you gave me a chance to sing. I think it is only fair I finally sing one just for you." He strikes the chords on the guitar, not the harsh, dissonant sound from before, but a warm, rolling acoustic melody that fills the freezing room with the heat of a Texas sunset. Dolly joins in her voice, blending perfectly with his. They do not sing to the cameras. They do not sing for the executives. They sing directly to the woman who pawned her wedding ring so a starving cowboy could chase a dream. Clara sits in the center of the stage, tears streaming freely down her face, her arthritic hands clutching her broken crochet purse. She closes her eyes, letting the music wash over her, not from a seat in the dark shadows, but from the very heart of the light. The first notes of the acoustic guitar do not just echo through the cavernous space of the moody theater, they seem to alter the very molecular structure of the air inside it. The freezing, sterile chill of the corporate air conditioning is suddenly overwhelmed by a warmth that radiates directly from the worn wooden body of George Strait's legendary instrument. He plays with his eyes closed, his broad shoulders relaxed into a posture of complete surrender to the melody. Beside him, Dolly Parton sways gently, her voice rising to meet his in a harmony so pure and steeped in genuine sorrow that it feels less like a performance and more like a deeply intimate prayer. The song is not a fast-paced radio hit meant to sell out stadiums. It is a slow, mournful ballad about dusty roads, lost time, and the enduring grace of the working class. It is a song about Texas. It is a song about survival. Sitting dead center on the illuminated stage, enveloped in the blinding glow of the million-dollar lighting rig, Clara looks entirely out of place and yet completely sacred. Her frayed grey wool coat absorbs the bright light, standing in stark contrast to the glittering rhinestones of Dolly's outfit and the pristine pearl snap shirt George wears. Her orthopedic shoes barely touch the polished floorboards. She clutches the torn remains of her handmade crochet purse against her chest, holding it as if it were a wounded bird. Her knuckles are white, the swollen joints of her arthritic fingers throbbing with a dull, constant ache. But for the first time in years, she does not feel the pain. The music washes over her, seeping into her tired bones, acting as a balm to a soul that has been battered by decades of relentless labor and quiet, unseen suffering. Tears slide freely down Clara's deeply lined face, carving paths through the thin layer of face powder she had carefully applied at 4 in the morning before boarding the Greyhound bus. She does not try to wipe them away. She is paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the moment. She looks at George, the man she still sees as the skinny, starving boy who used to sit in the corner booth of her diner, and she cannot reconcile the global icon standing before her with the desperate kid who once thought his dreams were entirely out of reach. His voice, deep, rich, and resonating with the immovable strength of a mountain, fills her ears, wrapping around her like a heavy quilt on a bitter winter night. In the shadows beyond the stage, the documentary crew stands frozen. The cynics of the entertainment industry, men and women who have spent their lives filming fabricated drama and manufactured emotions, are entirely captivated by the raw, unfiltered truth unfolding in front of their lenses. The young cameraman from Los Angeles, who just minutes ago was taking orders from the arrogant director Vance, slowly lifts his heavy rig onto his shoulder. Nobody tells him to do it. He acts on pure instinct, driven by the profound realization that he is witnessing something holy. He adjusts the focus, zooming past the glittering stage lights, past the famous faces of the country legends, and framing his shot entirely on Clara's calloused, trembling hands, clutching the broken purse. He captures the way the light catches a single tear falling onto the frayed yarn. In the sound booth, the hardened audio engineer, a man who has mixed tracks for every major pop star in the world, quietly reaches up and wipes his own eyes, his chest tight with an emotion he has not felt in decades. The final chord of the ballad rings out, vibrating through the wooden floorboards and slowly fading into the absolute silence of the theater. George does not immediately open his eyes. He lets the silence stretch, allowing the reverence of the moment to settle over the room like dust falling after a stampede. When he finally opens his eyes, he looks directly at Clara. He reaches up and silences the strings of his guitar with the flat of his palm. He unclips the heavy leather strap and carefully leans the priceless instrument against his microphone stand. George walks over to a tall wooden stool sitting near the drum kit, picks it up with one hand, and places it directly in front of Clara's leather chair. He sits down, his knees almost touching hers, bringing himself down to her eye level. He is a giant of a man, a titan of American culture, but in this moment he makes himself entirely small, entirely subservient to the frail woman sitting before him. Dolly steps up behind Clara's chair, resting her hands gently on the old woman's shoulders, a silent physical anchor of support. "Keep the cameras rolling," George says, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commands absolute obedience without a trace of anger. He does not look out into the darkness to see if they are obeying. He knows they are. Do not edit a single second of this. The world needs to know exactly who they are looking at. Clara shakes her head weakly, her voice trembling violently as she tries to speak. "George, please, you do not have to do this. You have already given me more than I could ever ask for just by letting me hear that song. I am just a diner cook. I am nobody. You are not nobody." Mrs. Clara, George interrupts, his voice thick with a fierce protective conviction. He leans forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You are the only reason I am not pouring concrete in San Antonio right now. You are the only reason anyone in this room knows my name." He reaches out and gently touches the torn edge of her crochet purse. "When I was picking up your things from the floor down there, I saw the photographs. I saw the picture of Arthur standing by the old gas pump in front of the diner. At the mention of her late husband's name, Clara's breath catches in her throat. A fresh wave of tears spills over her eyelashes. Arthur was a good man, she whispers, her voice cracking under the weight of a grief that 30 years of widowhood has never managed to erase. He loved your singing, George. He always told me that boy has a voice that sounds like a long dirt road heading home." George smiles, a sad, nostalgic expression that softens the hard granite of his features. He was a good man. He was a righteous man. But he was not the one who saved my life. You were. George turns his head slightly, looking directly into the lens of the primary documentary camera. He is not speaking to the crew anymore. He is speaking to the millions of people who will eventually watch this footage. He is stripping away the myth of the self-made cowboy and laying bare the absolute truth of his origins. It was the winter of 1976. George begins, his voice steady, but carrying the heavy emotional weight of the memory. The Texas wind was howling like a wounded animal, blowing ice and dust across the plains. I was driving a beat-up Ford pickup that burned more oil than gas. The heater was broken. The floorboards were rusted through. I had a guitar in the passenger seat and absolutely nothing else. I had been playing empty honky-tonks for weeks, making just enough in the tip jar to buy a tank of gas to get to the next empty room. I was exhausted, I was freezing, and I was completely broken in spirit. George pauses, his eyes drifting away from the camera and back to Clara's face. He is transporting himself back to that bitter morning, feeling the phantom chill of the rain soaking through his thin denim jacket. "My truck broke down 2 miles outside of your town." George continues, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate register. "I walked the rest of the way in the freezing rain, carrying my guitar case, because I was too terrified someone would steal it. My boots were filled with ice water. I could not feel my fingers. I saw the neon sign of your diner buzzing through the fog. The letter E was burnt out. It just said, Din R." Clara lets out a wet, breathy laugh, nodding her head. "Arthur never could get that letter fixed," she murmurs, wiping her cheek with the back of her swollen hand. "He said the food tasted the same whether the sign was spelled right or not." George nods, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I walked through those glass doors and the bell chimed. I must have looked like a drowned rat. I was tracking mud all over your clean linoleum floor. There were a few truckers sitting at the counter, and they all looked at me like I was trash blown in from the highway. I walked up to the counter and I asked you for a cup of hot water, just hot water. I figured I could wrap my hands around the mug to thaw my fingers so I could try to play my guitar on the street corner later. I did not have a single penny in my pocket. I could not even afford a black coffee. Dolly Parton, listening intently, squeezes Clara's shoulders gently, her own eyes welling with tears. She knows this story, not because George told her, but because she lived her own version of it in the mountains of Tennessee. The universal struggle of the starving artist, saved by the grace of a stranger. "You did not bring me hot water," George says, his voice tightening with emotion. "You looked at me. You looked right through the mud and the wet clothes and the pride I was desperately trying to hold on to. You did not ask me if I had money. You pointed to the booth in the far back corner near the radiator, and you told me to sit down and take off my wet jacket." Clara looks down at her hands, unable to meet his intense gaze. "You were shivering so hard your teeth were rattling, George. You were just a boy. You looked so thin I thought a strong gust of wind would carry you away. The good Lord gave us 2 hands for a reason, one to work the grill and one to lift up those who fall down. It was just a plate of food." "It was not just a plate of food," George corrects her, his tone firm and absolute. "You brought me a plate piled high with 3 scrambled eggs, thick-cut smoked bacon, hash browns smothered in gravy, and a mug of coffee so strong it could wake the dead. You set it down in front of me and you walked away before I could even try to lie and say I was not hungry. You let me eat in peace. You gave me back my dignity." George leans closer, his large hands clasping his own knees to keep them from shaking, and it did not stop there. "For 6 months, while I was sleeping in the bed of my truck parked behind the feed store, you fed me every single day, breakfast and dinner. You never kept a tab. You never asked when I was going to pay you back. When I tried to sweep the floors to earn my keep, you swatted me with your apron and told me to save my energy for singing. I loved hearing you practice in the alley behind the kitchen." Clara whispers, a soft smile touching her lips. "The stray cats used to gather around you. You always had such a gentle way with the creatures." George swallows hard, the memory of his absolute desperation rising in his throat. "But the food is not why we are sitting here today. The food kept me alive, but what you did next is the reason I have a career. The theater is so quiet that the hum of the lighting rig sounds like a jet engine. The crew is entirely motionless, terrified that the slightest sound might break the fragile, holy atmosphere of the room. The cameraman holds his breath, keeping the focus sharp on George's face as the legend prepares to reveal his deepest debt. "It was a Tuesday," George says, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I had finally gotten a call from a small recording studio in Austin. A producer had heard me playing at a dive bar and said if I could get to the studio and pay the $50 fee for the tape and the engineer's time, he would record a demo for me. $50. Back then it might as well have been $1 million. I went to the local bank and begged for a loan. The loan officer laughed at my boots, laughed at my guitar, and told me to get a real job in the oil fields." George looks down at the floorboards, the shame of that rejection still burning in his memory after all these years. "I walked back to your diner. I was ready to quit. I had made up my mind. I was going to sell my guitar to the pawn shop, buy a bus ticket back home, and go work the rigs. I sat at the counter and I told you I was done. I told you the dream was over." Clara begins to weep openly now, her frail shoulders shaking under her frayed wool coat. Dolly leans down and presses her cheek against Clara's silver hair, wrapping her arms around the old woman in a fierce, protective embrace. "You wiped your hands on your apron," George continues, his voice breaking slightly, forcing him to clear his throat. "You looked at me with those fierce eyes, and you told me that God does not put a song in a man's heart just to let it die in an oil field. Then you turned around and walked into the back office. You were gone for an hour. When you came back, you walked up to me and you slapped a $50 bill on the Formica counter." George reaches out and gently takes Clara's left hand. He turns it over, exposing the swollen knuckles and the deep calluses. He looks specifically at her ring finger. It is bare. There is a deep, permanent indentation in the flesh, a ghost of a ring that has not been worn in decades. "I asked you where you got the money," George says, his tears finally breaking free, tracking down his weathered cheeks. "You lied to me. You told me it was money from the tip jar. You told me it was extra profit from a good week. It took me 3 years to find out the truth. It took me 3 years to learn that you had walked down to the pawn shop on Main Street and traded your gold wedding band, the ring Arthur put on your finger the day you took your vows, just so a worthless stray kid could go sing into a microphone." The revelation hits the crew like a physical blow. The audio engineer in the booth covers his mouth with his hand, stifling a sob. The sheer weight of the sacrifice, the absolute selflessness of trading a sacred symbol of marriage to fund a stranger's dream, is a level of Christian charity that defies modern logic. Clara tries to pull her hand away, ashamed of her bare finger, but George holds onto it gently, refusing to let go. Arthur told me before he passed that a ring is just a piece of metal. Clara sobs, her voice barely intelligible through her tears. He said the real marriage is in the soul. That gold was just sitting on my hand doing nothing. You needed it, George. You had a light inside you. I could not let the world blow it out. I just could not. You gave away your most precious possession for me, George whispers, lifting her frail, calloused hand and pressing it to his forehead in a gesture of profound, absolute submission and respect. When I finally got my first record deal, the first thing I did was try to buy that ring back, but the pawn shop had already melted it down. It was gone. I sent you checks, Clara. I sent you letters with cash. I tried to buy you a new ring. I tried to pay you back 1,000 times over the last 40 years. Clara shakes her head, her tears falling onto George's hands. I never cashed those checks, George. I returned them to your management. You cannot pay back Grace with a checkbook. It was a gift. It was not a loan. You did not owe me anything. You gave me the greatest gift just by letting me hear your voice on the radio all these years. Knowing I had a tiny part in helping you fly, that was my reward. George lowers her hand, his expression shifting from deep sorrow to a sudden, sharp intensity. He reaches down to the floor where he had placed the broken crochet purse. He picks it up carefully and rests it on his knee. When I was gathering your things from the floor, George says, his voice losing its nostalgic softness and becoming dangerously sharp again, I saw more than just photographs. I saw the papers you were trying to hide. Clara's eyes widen in sheer terror. The blood drains from her face. She reaches out frantically, trying to grab the purse back from him, her pride suddenly wounded. No, George, please. Do not look at those. Please, those are private. That is my shame. Do not show those to the cameras. George does not let her take the purse. He opens the torn flap and reaches inside, pulling out a stack of tri-folded papers. The documents are printed on thick official paper, bearing the seal of a major Texas bank. The top pages are stamped with bold, aggressive red ink. The words scream off the page, a violent testament to the cruelty of a system that grinds the working class into dust. George stares at the red ink, his jaw tightening so hard the muscles in his cheeks twitch. The cold fury that had been directed at Vance earlier returns, but this time it is not directed at a single arrogant director. It is directed at the entire unjust machinery of the world. Clara buries her face in her hands, her frail shoulders heaving with the force of her sobs. The dignity she had fought so hard to maintain, the stoic pride of a Southern woman who never asked for handouts, is completely shattered. She feels exposed, humiliated, laid bare in front of the cameras and the $1,000,000 stage lights. I am so sorry, she weeps, her voice muffled behind her swollen hands. I did not want you to know. I did not want anyone to know. My heart has been failing, George. The hospital bills, they just kept piling up. The diner has not made a profit in years. The roof is caving in. The bank took the diner last month. Now they are taking the house. I have 2 weeks left before the sheriff comes to lock the doors. Dolly Parton lets out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. She looks at the bank papers in George's hand and then down at the weeping woman. The sheer injustice of it, the reality that the woman who literally funded the career of a multi-millionaire is about to be thrown onto the street, is a bitter, agonizing pill to swallow. I just wanted to hear you sing one last time. Clara sobs, her voice breaking into a fragile, desperate whisper. I bought the bus ticket with the last $20 I had to my name. I just wanted to sit in the dark and remember the good days before I have to pack my bags and go live in the State County facility. I did not want to bother you, George. I swear to God, I did not come here to beg. George Strait, the stoic, immovable cowboy, the man who has performed for presidents and royalty, sits on the wooden stool and allows the tears to flow freely down his face. He does not try to hide his emotion. He lets the cameras capture the absolute heartbreak in his eyes. He looks at the foreclosure notices, the cruel red ink demanding payment from a woman who gave away her only gold to help a stranger. He slowly, deliberately folds the bank papers in half. He does not put them back into the broken purse. He slides them into the front pocket of his own denim jeans, pressing them flat against his chest, right over his heart. He reaches out and gently pulls Clara's hands away from her face. He forces her to look at him. His eyes are burning with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. The sadness is still there, but it has been forged into a weapon of absolute determination. Mrs. Clara George says, his voice dropping to a low, resonant register that commands the attention of every single soul in the theatre. You listen to me, and you listen to me very carefully. You are not going to a state facility. You are not losing your house. And nobody is putting a padlock on the doors of that diner. Clara shakes her head, her eyes wide with confusion and despair. George, the debt is too big. It is tens of thousands of dollars. The bank will not listen to reason. They do not care about old women. They do not care about old women, George agrees, his voice turning cold and hard as steel. But they care about me, and they are going to care about what I have to say. George stands up from the wooden stool. His towering presence instantly fills the space. He looks past Clara, past Dolly, directly at the main executive producer, who is standing nervously near the front row of seats. Bob George calls out, his voice echoing like thunder across the empty auditorium. The producer flinches, stepping forward immediately. Yes, George, whatever you need. Scrap the script, George commands, gesturing sharply to the teleprompter screens hanging from the ceiling. Scrap the set list. Scrap the entire concept of this television special. We are not doing a polished Hollywood tribute to my career. The producer looks terrified, but he nods frantically. Okay, what are we doing instead? George looks down at Clara, his expression softening into a look of profound absolute loyalty. He places his large calloused hand gently on the crown of her silver hair, a protective blessing from a man who has finally found a way to repay an unpayable debt. We are taking these cameras, George says, his voice ringing with absolute finality. We are taking this entire crew, and we are getting on the tour buses. We are driving 6 hours west. We are going to a little broken-down diner off Highway 87. And we are going to show the whole damn world what real country music is built on. Dolly Parton lets out a triumphant cheer, clapping her hands together, the rhinestones flashing brilliantly in the stage lights. Amen, she shouts, her voice echoing through the theatre. Let the church say amen. The crew members in the shadows, the hardened technicians and cynical cameramen, erupt into spontaneous applause. The sound fills the auditorium, a roaring wave of genuine emotion and absolute support. The young cameraman from Los Angeles keeps his lens focused on George's face, capturing the exact moment the king of country music declares war on the poverty that threatens his greatest benefactor. Clara looks up at George, her tear-stained face illuminated by the blinding lights, her heart pounding with a fragile, terrifying new emotion. Hope. George smiles down at her, tipping the brim of his imaginary hat. Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Clara? Because I think it is time I finally bought you that cup of hot water. The sheer logistical nightmare of moving a multi-million-dollar television production 6 hours across the vast expanse of Texas is a task that would normally take weeks of corporate planning and endless boardroom meetings. But when George Strait gives an order, the machinery of the music industry moves with terrifying efficiency. The atmosphere backstage transforms instantly from the sterile tension of Vance's regime to a frantic, chaotic energy driven by genuine purpose. The crew members who just hours ago were dragging their feet under the oppressive weight of Hollywood arrogance are now moving with a fierce, almost religious fervor. Cables are frantically coiled, lights are dismantled with practiced speed, and the massive black road cases are violently shoved onto the loading docks. Outside the moody theater, the brutal afternoon sun is beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the Texas sky in violent streaks of bruised purple and burning orange. A fleet of 5 sleek black luxury tour buses idles on the asphalt, their heavy diesel engines rumbling a low mechanical growl that vibrates through the soles of every boot on the pavement. The air smells of exhaust fumes, ozone from the cooling stage lights, and the distant scent of dry earth preparing for the night. George does not ride in his private, custom-built luxury coach. He leaves that for the executive producers, who are still frantically making phone calls to the network, trying to explain the massive deviation from the script. Instead, George walks directly to the lead bus, a slightly older model used by the core band members. He opens the heavy pneumatic door and steps aside, offering his hand to Clara. She is exhausted, her frail body trembling from the emotional whiplash of the day, but her eyes hold a fragile, terrified spark of hope that was entirely absent when she first sat in the dark theatre. She grips George's calloused hand, her swollen, arthritic fingers, finding safety in his solid grip, and slowly climbs the steps. Dolly Parton follows close behind, carrying Clara's broken crochet purse like it is a priceless artifact, refusing to let any of the frantic crew members touch it. The interior of the bus is a stark contrast to the sterile theatre. It smells of old leather, stale coffee, and the faint lingering aroma of decades of road life. George guides Clara to the most comfortable leather recliner at the front of the bus, right behind the driver. He pulls a heavy wool blanket from the overhead compartment and drapes it carefully over her frail shoulders, tucking the edges around her to ward off the chill of the air conditioning. He sits in the seat, directly across from her, his long legs stretched out, his pristine Stetson resting on his knee. The convoy pulls away from the loading dock, the heavy buses merging onto the interstate heading west toward the setting sun. The journey is long and quiet. The documentary crew has mounted 2 small cameras inside the bus, capturing the silent, intimate moments between the legend and the woman who saved him. George does not speak much. He watches the endless miles of barbed wire fences and grazing cattle roll past the tinted windows, his jaw tight, his mind clearly churning with a silent, furious determination. Clara, exhausted by the sheer magnitude of the day, eventually closes her eyes, her breathing evening out as she falls into a deep, restorative sleep, lulled by the rhythmic hum of the diesel engine and the absolute certainty that she is safe. It is past midnight when the convoy finally exits the main highway and turns onto the cracked, uneven asphalt of Highway 87. The road is dark, illuminated only by the sweeping headlights of the massive buses. They pass abandoned gas stations, rusted silos, and the skeletal remains of forgotten towns that have been slowly swallowed by the relentless Texas dust. The buses slow to a crawl, their air brakes hissing loudly in the quiet night. They pull into a large gravel parking lot. The crunch of the heavy tires over the stones sounds like an earthquake in the absolute silence of the rural landscape. George stands up, gently shaking Clara awake. "Mrs. Clara," he says softly, his voice a low rumble. "We are here." Clara blinks her eyes, adjusting to the dim light of the bus. She looks out the window and gasps, her hand flying to her mouth. The diner stands exactly where it has stood for 50 years, a small weathered building with peeling white paint and a sagging roof. The neon sign that once buzzed brightly in the fog of 1976 is completely dark. A heavy, rusted padlock hangs from the front door, a brutal physical manifestation of the bank foreclosure notice resting in George's pocket. The windows are dark, the inside completely devoid of life. It looks like a tomb, a monument to a lifetime of hard work that has been casually discarded by a ruthless economy. But it is not going to stay dark for long. The doors of the buses hiss open and the crew pours out into the cool night air. The frantic energy returns, but this time it is focused entirely on the small diner. The executive producer Bob stands by the lead bus, barking orders into a walkie-talkie. The young cameraman from Los Angeles hoists his rig onto his shoulder, instantly capturing the stark, heartbreaking visual of the abandoned building. George steps off the bus, reaching back to help Clara down the steps. She leans heavily on his arm, her eyes fixed on the padlock. A fresh wave of despair washes over her, the reality of her failure hitting her harder than before. "George," she whispers, her voice breaking. "It is gone. The bank changed the locks yesterday. We cannot even go inside." George does not look at the padlock. He looks at the heavy duty bolt cutters resting in the open bed of a local pickup truck that had followed the convoy from Austin. He walks over, picks up the massive steel tool, and walks directly to the front door of the diner. "George, what are you doing, Bob?" the producer yells, running forward, his hands waving frantically. "You cannot do that. That is bank property now. That is breaking and entering. We will be sued. We will be arrested." George turns his head slowly, the brim of his Stetson casting a dark shadow over his eyes. He looks at the panicked executive with a gaze so cold and unyielding that Bob instantly stops in his tracks. Bob George says, his voice dangerously quiet. "You have two choices right now. You can get back on that luxury bus and drive back to Los Angeles and explain to the network why you lost the biggest television special of the decade. Or you can turn those cameras on and document exactly what happens when a Texas cowboy decides to settle his debts." Bob swallows hard, looking at the massive steel bolt cutters in George's hands and then at the documentary crew who are already rolling, capturing every second of the confrontation. The producer steps back, raising his hands in surrender. "Roll cameras," he mutters into his walkie-talkie. "Keep rolling." George turns back to the door. He slides the heavy steel jaws of the bolt cutters over the hardened shank of the padlock. He grips the long handles, his broad shoulders flexing under his pearl snap shirt, and squeezes with brutal, practiced force. The thick steel of the lock groans, resisting for a fraction of a second before snapping with a loud, sharp crack that echoes across the empty parking lot. The heavy lock falls to the concrete floor with a dull thud. George reaches out and pushes the glass door open. The bell attached to the top of the door frame, the same bell that chimed when a starving, freezing boy walked in 40 years ago, rings out with a clear, familiar sound. Clara lets out a choked sob, her hands covering her face. Dolly steps up beside her, wrapping a protective arm around her waist. "Come on, honey," Dolly whispers, her voice thick with emotion. "Let us go inside." George reaches over and flips the main breaker switch on the wall. The fluorescent lights flicker violently, buzzing loudly, before finally illuminating the interior. The diner is exactly as it was left, a time capsule of honest labor. The Formica counter is clean, the red vinyl stools are cracked but sturdy, and the old cast-iron griddle sits cold and silent in the back kitchen. The air smells faintly of stale coffee and old grease, a scent that hits George with the force of a physical blow, bringing a fresh wave of tears to his eyes. The crew floods into the small space, setting up lights and running cables with frantic precision. They transform the abandoned diner into a brilliant illuminated stage in a matter of minutes. The young cameraman frames a shot of George standing behind the counter, his hands resting on the cool Formica, looking out at the empty room. George pulls the folded bank papers from his pocket. The foreclosure notices, the medical debt, the final warnings. He places them flat on the counter, directly under the bright lights of the camera. He looks directly into the lens, his face set in a mask of absolute, terrifying resolve. "My name is George Strait," he begins, his voice resonating with a power that shakes the very walls of the small building, "and I am standing in the exact spot where my life was saved." He points a calloused finger down at the bank papers, the cruel red ink glaring under the lights. These papers say that this woman, Mrs. Clara, owes a debt. They say she owes tens of thousands of dollars to a hospital that tried to save her failing heart, and to a bank that decided her lifetime of labor was not worth extending a line of credit. They say she failed. They say she is done. George reaches into his back pocket and pulls out a pristine leather checkbook. He slaps it down onto the counter right next to the foreclosure notices. The sound is sharp and final. He pulls a silver pen from his shirt pocket, clicks it open, and begins to write. He does not hesitate, he does not calculate. He writes a number so massive, so entirely overwhelming, that the producer standing behind the camera physically flinches. He signs his name with a heavy, deliberate stroke, tearing the check from the book and placing it directly on top of the red ink. "I am paying this debt," George says, his voice echoing through the diner, ringing with the absolute authority of a man who has finally balanced the scales of the universe. Every single penny. The hospital, the bank, the mortgage on her house, and the repairs for this roof. It is done. He looks up from the counter, his eyes locking onto Clara, who is standing near the door, supported by Dolly, completely paralyzed by shock. Her mouth is open, but no sound comes out. The sheer magnitude of the gesture, the absolute obliteration of the financial terror that has been crushing her soul for years, is too massive to comprehend. George walks around the counter, closing the distance between them. He stops in front of her, looking down into her terrified, tear-stained eyes. "But that is just the money," George says softly, his voice dropping to an intimate register. "That just clears the books." That does not pay you back for the ring. That does not pay you back for the grace. He reaches into his front pocket and pulls out a small square velvet box. It is worn the corners slightly, frayed, a box he has carried with him for years, hoping against hope that he would one day find the woman who sacrificed everything for him. He opens the box. Resting on the dark velvet is a heavy, solid gold band. It is not a diamond ring. It is not flashy or extravagant. It is a simple, thick band of pure gold, an exact replica of the wedding ring Clara pawned 40 years ago. Clara gasps, her knees buckling slightly. Dolly catches her, holding her steady. "I could not find the original." George whispers, his voice breaking, a single tear escaping and tracking down his weathered cheek. The pawn shop melted it down. "I am so sorry, Clara. I tried. But I had this one made. I had the jeweler engrave the inside." He carefully lifts the ring from the box, holding it up to the light. The camera zooms in, capturing the delicate script etched into the pure gold. "For the woman who gave me a voice." George reaches out and gently takes Clara's left hand. He slides the heavy gold band onto her bare ring finger. It slides perfectly over the swollen, arthritic knuckle, settling into the deep, permanent indentation left by the original ring. It fits perfectly. The weight of the gold, the sheer physical reality of the restored symbol of her marriage, breaks the last remaining dam of Clara's stoicism. She collapses against George's chest, burying her face in his pearl snap shirt, sobbing with a force that shakes her entire frail body. She grips the fabric of his shirt, her fingers digging into his shoulders, weeping not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming, crushing weight of absolute redemption. George wraps his massive arms around her, holding her tight, burying his face in her silver hair. He closes his eyes, letting his own tears fall freely, soaking into the frayed wool of her coat. He does not care about the cameras. He does not care about his stoic image. He is just a man holding the woman who gave him the world. Dolly Parton stands beside them, tears streaming down her face, clapping her hands together in a silent, joyous prayer. The crew members, the hardened cynics of the industry, are openly weeping. The young cameraman wipes his eyes with the back of his hand, his chest heaving, keeping the focus sharp on the gold ring shining on Clara's finger. The silence in the diner is profound, broken only by the sound of Clara's sobs and the distant hum of the diesel engines outside. It is a holy silence, the sound of a universe realigning itself, the sound of true justice being served not in a courtroom, but in a small weathered diner on a forgotten highway in Texas. Months later, the documentary airs on national television. The network executives, terrified of the deviation from the script, are entirely unprepared for the absolute cultural explosion that follows. The pristine, highly edited footage of the rehearsal in the Moody Theatre is completely overshadowed by the raw, unfiltered reality of the confrontation with Vance, the heartbreak of the spilled purse, and the absolute devastating power of the scene in the abandoned diner. The film shatters every viewership record in the history of the network. It does not just win awards, it sparks a massive national conversation about the treatment of the elderly, the crushing weight of medical debt, and the true meaning of Christian charity. The arrogance of Vance, the corporate greed of the bank, are laid bare for the world to see, juxtaposed against the absolute selfless grace of a diner cook and the unyielding loyalty of a Texas cowboy. The small weathered diner off Highway 87 does not remain closed. With the debts entirely cleared and a massive influx of donations from fans across the globe, the building is fully restored. The roof is fixed, the neon sign is repaired, buzzing brightly once again, spelling out diner in perfect glowing red letters. But Clara does not go back to working the grill. She hires a local family to run the day-to-day operations, sitting in her favorite booth near the radiator, drinking hot coffee and talking to the thousands of people who travel from all over the country, just to sit in the room where the legend of George Strait was born. She wears the heavy gold band on her left hand every single day, rubbing her thumb over the smooth metal. A constant physical reminder that grace given freely is never truly lost. George Strait, the king of country music, continues to sell out stadiums across the world. But he never forgets the lesson learned in the dark theater. He never forgets the feeling of the heavy steel bolt cutters in his hands. He stands on the biggest stages, his acoustic guitar slung over his shoulder, his pristine Stetson pulled low, singing the songs that made him a legend. But before he plays the final chord of every show, he looks out into the massive sea of faces, his eyes scanning the shadows, searching for the quiet, hard-working people who built the world he stands on. He tips his hat a silent salute to the unseen heroes, knowing with absolute certainty that the true crown of a king is not made of platinum records or sold-out arenas, but of the quiet, unyielding respect for the roots that hold him up.